It's that time of the year again, and I know how I'm going to be spending Halloween. The same way that I have for the past 2 years, which is slowly nursing a beer in the bar. But I'm not there to get drunk. I'm there to escape. I never want to be alone at home on Halloween night ever again. And I promised the deputy that I wouldn't talk about that night. The town didn't need it. Hell, I even deleted the video. But now, with Halloween being around the corner, it all comes back. Well, small town law enforcement doesn't care too much about the no sleep subreddit. I live in a small house at the end of the lane, and it's just a nondescript house that's down a row of its sisters. It's prefabricated mostly, and it's far enough off the beaten path to be cheap, but not so far as to be rural, but close. So I didn't expect many kids to call around trick-or-treat come Halloween. It's a long road, and most children manage to get their baskets filled long before they get to my place. Besides, I like the peace and quiet. Halloween used to be a good night to settle down and catch some of the classic horror movies on TV. I kept a couple of bags of candy around just in case some kids actually made it all the way down to my house, but mostly it would be an evening all to myself. I can't quite remember what I was watching that night, probably because I had been enjoying an after-dinner beer and I may have gotten carried away and I dozed off. But I woke with a start. My beer had gone warm on the side table, my hand still curled around the can. I winced as I unwrapped my fingers because something had woken me up. The TV was on in the background and the senseless drivel of late-night programming flickered across the room. Maybe it was just some high school kids out after some Halloween party that were making the noise that woke me up. So I checked the time. It was past midnight, and I was glad that I had invested in a little security for my house. Just the basics, really. I had a good camera to cover my front lawn and motion-activated lights around the front and the back. I was trying to make the tough decision of whether to clear up the mess right there and then or to just kick the can down the road to the next morning when a loud rapping at the door shattered the silence. The can of beer bounced off the floor and warm beer sprayed across the bottom of my track pants, but the shock left me too numb even to swear, so I just set the can back upright when the knocking started again. That a rhythmic rap, increasingly impatient. The tempo was building as I stepped towards the door. I peered around the edge of the window, but I didn't see anything except my own reflection. It was pitch black outside, but why wasn't the light working? Then suddenly the knocking stopped. Maybe it was a tree branch or something else that was tapping on the porch. The peephole glared at me, that little glass orb suddenly bulging with some half-promised horror. I swallowed, or at least I tried. My throat was dry, so the warm beer on the floor was inviting. I said out loud, "It's nothing." I was hoping that the familiar echo of my voice off the walls would ground me somehow. I walked up to the door and I peered out, only seeing the orange cones cast by the halogen streetlights a distance away. It was nothing, I thought to myself, and I felt childishly stupid. So I sucked in a deep breath, and then I let the air out slowly. But then, another knock. I turned around to face the door, and my heart punched at the inside of my chest, its crazed dancing playing counterpoint to the knocking. I wasn't surprised to see my hand shake as I reached for the doorknob. Our town was a safe one, far from the troubles of the big cities, or so we had read in the papers. We had little more to fear in the night than seeing our trash strewn across the yard by the nimble fingers of raccoons. I threw the door open and the porch lights came on and they suddenly blinded me. I blinked away the white spots from my vision and a pair of children stood on my porch. They must have been about 9 or 10. I couldn't see much more of them because they were in the classic Halloween getup. A simple sheet that was draped over each one of them and a pair of holes that were cut out for their eyes for them to see through. They also had a pair of small baskets for the candy. When I looked down at their toes, I saw brand new dress shoes. A boy and a girl, I thought. Such a common refrain. I'd expected the words, but not the delivery. There were 2 figures in front of me, yet their voices seemed to come from a great distance away. They said again, I felt a little discomforted at the distortion in their voices. Their voices seemed to blend into each other's with some strange harmonics at play at the edges. It seemed almost as though there were a choir of two just there speaking to me. Treat, I guess, I said. More than anything, I wanted these two away from my house. The whole situation felt wrong. The familiar veneer of the season was concealing something deeper, something rotten. For a moment, I blamed the haze of alcohol or the dregs of sleep clouding my judgment, but adrenaline had swept those far away. My fear was true. I turned to the counter where I kept my keys and grabbed for the bag of candy that I had prepared for the occasion. I was half hoping that the two figures would be gone when I returned to the door. Maybe they had been a figment of my imagination. Maybe just a shadow of some dream brought on by cheap horror movies and cold pizza. But I had no such luck. The pair had not moved an inch. They each raised their baskets, and there was already an assortment of candy there. They'd had a good day. It's a bit late for you guys to be out, isn't it? Where are your parents? The only answer I got was an impatient shaking of the baskets, the rasp of candy wrappers rustling. I held out a handful of candy, ready to drop it and call it a night, and I expected to see a small hand clutching at the handle of the basket. But instead, I saw the anemic matte sheen of plastic. The basket was draped off the plastic hand of some kind of store mannequin. I was more than thoroughly creeped out by this effective little trick. Maybe the voices were recorded. Just a little bit of technology to bolster an otherwise traditional costume. I felt the fear melt away as I explained it to myself in my head. They were just some clever little children, probably with the help of an adult. Smart, I thought. It certainly had me going for a while. I told them to stay safe and dropped the last of the candy into the baskets. They didn't acknowledge me. They just stood still on the worn wooden boards of my porch, and then I shut the door on them. The window darkened as the light of the porch shut off. That was odd. Maybe the motion detection had stopped working. Some unbidden instinct told me to stay there and wait. And then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch as the two walked off. But still the light stayed dark. My relief grew as the odd strangers left my property. But still something didn't sit right. Something wasn't right. The light was working. It turned on when it detected me. It saw me, but it didn't see the kids. The sensor was working. It was state-of-the-art. Passive infrared. It detected motion by detecting changes in temperature. Like a human body, like mine, but not the kids. Whatever was under those pristine white sheets wasn't warm at all. The realization washed over me like an ice cube running down my spine. My breath came in short rasps. I had to see, I had to know, and I could barely bring my hand to the curtains because they were shaking so badly. When I pinched the edge of the curtain between my thumb and my finger, the curtain began to undulate wildly. I filled my lungs with air, and then I peered out through the glass. They were still there, barely 20 yards away from me. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, motionless and facing the street. And as I watched, they both swiveled their heads in perfect tandem to affix two pairs of fathomless eye holes on the window. There was no way they could have seen me come to the window. Now I had to put the back of my hand in my mouth and bite down hard to keep from calling out. They knew that I was there. I backed away from the window, dragging my leaden feet over the carpeted floor. I barely noticed when my heel knocked the can back. The beer can leaked out onto the carpet, leaving a widening patch in front of me. I could not believe the raw animal fear those two had summoned up in me. Every instinct I had told me to run and get help, do anything but stay and be trapped in my own house. But what could I do? Call the police and tell them I was scared of two little children trick-or-treating? Call one of my friends past midnight and ask them to come over like a little boy crawl into his parents' room after a nightmare? There had to be a rational explanation for this, but I could not explain away the light, fluttery feeling in my stomach, and I could not rationalize the prickly lump at the back of my throat. They had only said 3 words to me in those unearthly tones. I shut the door to the kitchen, and the sound echoed through the empty house. I turned my chair to face the front door, and then I waited, white-knuckled, for the dawn to come. I must have fallen asleep sometime during that long, cold wait, not daring to move from my chair, paralyzed with fear that one of those shrouded children would appear at my window, or worst yet, behind me. But even that manic store of energy wore out as the night wound to a close. I was woken up by a polite knock on the front door, and I sat straight up, nearly falling off of my chair. I stumbled to the door, and a hint of the dread from a few hours ago was still lingering, like a stale funk in the air. I checked the peephole again, and this time I was confronted with the well-scrubbed face of one of our town deputies. We had been to school together, and it was that kind of small town where you would know almost everybody your age if they had a history there. He was an earnest man, tough but fair. "Good morning, officer." "Good morning," he replied, but the sour look on his face told me that it was anything but. His nose twitched as he took in the stale, sour smell of beer steaming off the floor in the morning sun. "Had a good night last night." I thought back to the night before. No, I didn't. The lawman was quick to see the fleeting shadow of death wash across my face. "You care to explain why you stole the 2 mannequins from the store, dressed them up, and then put them on your lawn?" He shifted to the side, and past his door-filling bulk, I saw 2 familiar shapes on my lawn. My lungs would not fill with air. They were still there. They had been there the whole time. "You okay, buddy?" The big man leaned in, blocking my view, and steadied my shoulder with one of his strong hands. I brushed his hand off and lurched out into the yard, mindless of the freezing dew on my bare feet. The pair, they stood there, the draped sheets joined in between them. They were holding hands. The 2 of them were holding hands. I brought my palm down gingerly on the head of the one closest to me, hard. I felt plastic. I whipped the sheet off with one smooth motion. I gave a strangled cry as I stared into the empty green eyes of a child mannequin. I backed away, too quick. I ended up on my butt on the cold grass, clawing and scrambling backwards until I bumped into the solid legs of the deputy behind me. He'd been quick to recognize my unease earlier. He was just as quick to realize genuine fear. He helped me back up to my feet and helped me back into my house. "Would you mind telling me what that was all about?" He dumped me on the office chair in front of my computer. I tried, but I could not force the words out. The deputy sighed and settled onto my couch, wrinkling his nose at the empty beer cans on the side table. He leaned forward and he said, "First call of the morning after Halloween, and I'm chasing down some BS break-in to a store in the middle of town. Now I've got you hungover and scared shitless from a damned pair of dolls on your front yard. What I know is someone got into a store, smashed up the glass, stole sheets and a couple of mannequins. Bloody kids again, except the glass." The lines on his brow deepened. The glass was on the outside of the shop only. "Damnedest thing, you've got a camera on your yard, don't you?" I nodded, numbly. "What say you give me another 10 minutes of your time, tops? We go through that footage and I can see who put those things on your lawn." I turned to face my computer and called up the stored videos on my hard drive. They were all transferred by Wi-Fi. The deputy said, "Just put it on double speed, backwards, and then we will soon see who set them up there." So I hit the reverse play key and upped the speed. I saw the 2 of us scuttle from the house to the lawn and back again. Then the first rays of the sun retreating from the grass, pulling back over the pair of figures until they were back in darkness. The 2 of them stood there motionless for the longest time. But when the figures moved all about themselves in a jerky, swaying motion back from my lawn to my front door, the cursor danced a little jig in the corner of my screen as the shakes returned, stronger than before. The sharp hiss behind me told me that I was not alone in my discomfort. I shuddered as I watched myself on screen so close to the two abominations, giving them a handful of candy each. I slowed the recording back to normal speed, and on screen I saw myself turn back into the house to retrieve the candy. The two figures, they just stood there. As one, they both fixed those dark eye holes on the sheets. There was something else unmistakable. There was a slight pulse in the sheets, a small undulation. The mannequins were breathing. The deputy said, "I've seen enough." I turned to look at him, and his face was as white as the sheets on the shrouded figures on the screen, his hand tight around the grip of his sidearm. That, of all things, scared me the most. He was a symbol of law and order. He had seen the worst of what our little community had to offer, and he was just as scared as I was, and he was ready to pull a gun in my house. I clicked the window shut and I got up. I wandered over to my cabinet and I pulled out a pair of tumblers and a bottle of the good stuff. I set one glass down in front of the deputy, and then I took a sip from my glass. The deputy did not hesitate when he emptied half of his glass, and he did not look at me when he spoke. A lawman could lose his job drinking on duty. He said that his grandmother wasn't from around here. She was back from the old country across the sea, he said. She hated Halloween. She said there were things out that night that weren't meant to see the light of day. One night a year, she told him, for one single night, some things were set loose. The candy and costumes, they were a new thing. But back in the past, on All Hallows Eve, good folk would cross themselves and prayed and stayed in. So whatever is on that recording, that is not what our town needs. You understand? They were just some dumb high school kids fooling around. The lie was beginning to take shape and form in my mouth. The lie fleshed out, and it took on a veneer of credibility. That would be the explanation. No one had to know the dark kernel of that story. And your camera, it was just having technical difficulties that night. It never was a good piece of equipment. Regretted buying it the same week. He stuck out his hand and we shook on it, and I have kept my word until now. There isn't really a good reason why I broke my promise. I had just never known true fear until that night, and it has replayed in my head over and over again. The recording is long gone, of course, but every detail of that night has been branded onto my mind. I remember the fear, but I cannot think of a single action that the two of them had done to threaten me. Eerie, unnatural, but without a drop of malice. It'll be Halloween soon, and I know where I'll be on that dark night. Some things roam the streets that should not be there. The masks and costumes aren't always for the children. Sometimes they're there for the adults, for our own protection. After the deputy left, I watched the video forwards just once, and I remember seeing the two figures on my lawn slowly inching their hands up, locking them under the sheets and waiting for the sun to rise. Things that shouldn't be out on this good earth. But sometimes, just sometimes, they just want the simple things, like one last trick-or-treat.